everyone, and welcome to week 3. This week, we are going to be talking about how infectious diseases can be controlled. We will talk about how public health has succeeded in its role to eradicate some infectious diseases. We will discuss relevant issues with infectious diseases and explain why some of them are on the rise, and how understanding the chain of infection can help reduce transmission of a disease. The assignments that are due this week include a measles outbreak blog, a chain of infection worksheet, herd immunity simulation worksheet, chapters 9 and 10 quiz, and of course your discussion board. For the chain of infection worksheet, the purpose is to help you become familiar with the chain of infection. And what you will do is go through the chain of infection with one of the viruses presented. So in order to complete this assignment, you will need to review the chain of infection, which is in chapter 9 of your textbook, and the what. You will list the chain of infection and describe each stage, and then choose one of the following diseases and walk through the chain of infection. You can do polio, rabies, measles, or smallpox. For that, you can use your textbook, the internet, Harper Library to complete the information. And then for the criteria, your project should contain a description of each component of the chain of infection, and then walk through the chain of infection using only one of the diseases above. The next assignment is herd immunity. Here is the worksheet for herd immunity, and the purpose of it is to gain a better understanding of what herd immunity is, and talk about it as it relates to herd epidemic. Interestingly enough, this is a really hot topic right now with the COVID-19 virus, is how to obtain herd immunity and at what point will we have herd immunity. So to complete this assignment, you'll need to read about epidemics and herd immunity in your textbook. And then I've also provided you some websites to help you complete this assignment. So first, under the what, you are going to define epidemic. You will write it here. What is an epidemic? And then for number 2, you're going to define what is herd or community immunity. Then you will visit this website here, Science Buddies. I've already opened it here. But one thing to take note is when I first opened it, I had to allow the website, or I had to allow my browser to accept cookies from that website. So you may have to do that to get the website to work on your computer. And so what this is it shows some graphs on different types of immunity. So with no immunity, here's what a viral epidemic would look like. You can put your cursor at different days. The days are down here, and it gives you the 1 to 5 estimate. So at day 59, how many are infected, how many show symptoms, how many are immune, how many deaths, and don't worry about the green one. Then number 2 is community immunity that can change the course of an outbreak. So now we're talking about community immunity and how people are protected, and then what the disease outbreak looks like. So you can see here, it looks quite different than when we have no immunity. And then last is you're going to run your own simulations to determine what is that herd immunity threshold for COVID-19. Here are the directions how to do it. And here's where you would do it. So you would put customized settings. Let me open that in a new tab so you can see what it looks like. You might have to sign in. Let's go back. Customize settings. And here is where you will customize settings to see what the threshold, or to determine what the threshold should be for COVID-19. We'll run the simulation for 365 days. For population statistics, what is the death rate? How many hospital beds per capita? And this is the percentage of people. And the total population, you don't have to change any of this. Here's where you're going to change the percent of immune individuals. Immune individuals would be those who received the vaccine or have acquired natural immunity through getting the virus. And this is where you'll start to play around with some of the numbers to determine what is that minimum number. What percent of people at a minimum need to be immune from COVID in order for us to achieve herd immunity? And then you would click on done. It would run the simulation. And you can see here when the chart comes up, what the chart will look like. So you'll play around with those numbers a little bit so that you can figure out what the threshold is. Let me go back to the worksheet. So you'll use the first two scenarios to complete this table. Answer some questions based on it. Number 4 and 5 are the ones where you'll complete your own customized simulations. And then what I've provided here is another website to run a simulation to see what are the effects of vaccination and how a virus spreads through a community. And then you can compare it to the one we ran earlier. And so here again, you can change how many people are vaccinated and then restart the simulation. It'll keep running. This will start filling itself in. You can watch how people move around. You can see houses. That might be a church, apartment building, grocery store. So you can see the movement of people, public transportation, and so forth. Okay, so moving on to the lecture for this week. When we talk about infectious diseases, first, these are diseases that can be caught from another person. They're ones that include a pathogen, so something that a bug that can get you sick. The past major killers include bubonic plague, which is the Black Death, tuberculosis, smallpox, cholera, typhoid, typhus, yellow fever, diphtheria, measles, and influenza. There were some that believed that we have conquered diseases in 1960s because of immunization and antibiotics. They were wrong, but infectious agents, so these are the bugs that give you the disease, include bacteria, viruses, parasites. Those are the pathogens. Now here is the chain of infection. You have the pathogen, which is that infectious agent, reservoir, where it lives, means of transmission. How is it passing from one thing to another? A susceptible host. And then I need you to consider, we can interrupt this chain of infection at any point. Here are means of transmission. It could be aerosol, meaning it's in the air, it's in your spit, or your coughing. It could be through touching contaminated objects and putting your hands to your mouth, nose, or eyes. The reason that's important, we say, okay, you touch a contaminated object, but then you have to touch your mouth, nose, or eyes, because your skin is a barrier, right? It's a natural barrier. However, your mouth, inside your nose, and your eyes, those mainly consist of mucous membranes, which is not a barrier. And so if you touch your eye and you have something on your hand, it's going to immediately enter your body. Same with your mouth and your nose. Another means of transmission is contaminated water or food, or fecal oral route. Fecal is poop, and then oral is your mouth. And that sounds kind of weird, right? No one's going to put poop in their mouth. However, if people are not washing their hands after using the bathroom and then touching surfaces, and then you're touching surfaces and touch your mouth, nose, or eyes, that's a means of transmission. Vectors are things that carry it. So think of rabies. The vector would be the animal that's infected with rabies, and then sexual contact. So when we interrupt the chain of infection, we, in fact, reduce the rates of transmission. Here are the different ways that we can interrupt the chain of infection. We can kill the pathogen with antibiotics. We can eliminate the reservoir where it lives. We can prevent transmission by washing hands, quarantining, using condoms. And we can increase resistance of the host by immunization. In terms of public health measures, it's really important for public health officials to survey what diseases are where, what is it, which people are at risk, what communities have higher rates, and so forth. They also conduct contact tracing. Now, they initially started with COVID, which was a way to see how this new disease was being transmitted, but it ended up just being too many people for it to be effective. Contact tracing works really well back when we had the HIV epidemic, where you're looking at the people people had sex or sexual contact with, and that definitely helped narrow down the mode of transmission or the route of transmission. With COVID, because it's airborne, contact tracing is really not that effective. We can do immunization and treatment of identified patients to prevent further spread, and then quarantine if necessary. So here's an example of how public health controlled the spread of infection. For SARS, was controlled by very classic public health measures. Rabies is controlled by looking at wildlife, by immunizing dogs, and by post-exposure prophylaxis. Post-exposure, so if a person is exposed to rabies, there are a series of shots that person can be given so they do not become infected or affected by the rabies virus. There's also been eradication. So this is possible if there is no non-human reservoir and a vaccine exists. For example, smallpox was eradicated in 1977. However, there are still laboratories that contain the virus. And now, since so much time has passed and we do not give out vaccinations for smallpox, there is a slight possibility it could come back. Polio was eradicated from the Western Hemisphere. It only exists in a few countries now. And there's some religious opposition to polio vaccines in a few countries where they do not vaccinate their population against polio, so it would still exist. And then measles is the next target. It's no longer considered an endemic in the US. So what endemic means, it's different from epidemic. Epidemic means there's a spike in a disease or illness in a specific community or general population in a specific area. Whereas pandemic is a rise in a new disease or emerging disease worldwide. Endemic means that it's persistent. So it's going to persist in the community, in the area for a long time. You'll see spikes and it'll go down, but it will not be eradicated. And so it's considered endemic when it just persists in the community. And so measles is considered endemic. There is a persistence in the community. However, it's not really a problem anymore in the US because most kids get the measles vaccination. And so once in a while, you'll see maybe a measles outbreak at a school or preschool, but really it's not a huge concern because most people have been vaccinated, which keeps the numbers down. So there's always been a fear of vaccines. There have been rumors that vaccines cause autism, SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome, but those are rumors. Now, of course, there are side effects for some vaccines. Some parents refuse to accept the risks, but if too many people do not get vaccinated, we're going to lose our herd immunity. And pharmaceutical companies are reluctant to develop vaccines. There's not a lot of profits in there, and there's a risk of lawsuits. We're moving on now to Chapter 10, which is the resurgence of infectious diseases. HIV/AIDS was first recognized in the US in 1981. It is now considered a worldwide killer. It is caused by a retrovirus and attacks the immune system. And when we do screening tests, what the test looks for are antibodies. You can measure viruses in the blood. And now many drugs are available to help treat HIV/AIDS. They are really effective. Now, most people who have the HIV virus, their lifespans are very similar to those who do not have the virus. Other emerging viruses include Ebola, monkeypox, the hantavirus, other hemorrhagic fevers, West Nile virus, and SARS. And as you may or may not know, COVID-19 is related to SARS. So here are some factors that lead to emergence of new infections. Human activities that cause ecological damage and close contact with wildlife, and so perhaps the disease exists in a certain wildlife or animal that makes the jump to human infection. Some of the modern agricultural practices. International travel is really a big one, and we have that example perfectly now with COVID, where it started off in China and you saw how quickly it spread worldwide in a short amount of time. International distribution of food and exotic animals, and then breakdown of social restraints on sexual behavior and intravenous drug use. When you think about the flu, the common flu that has been around forever, that virus is constantly mutating, so it's constantly changing a little bit, which is why when you get a flu vaccination, it doesn't last forever. It lasts a year. And what scientists actually do, is they look at the different strains of the flu and they try to determine which one is going to be the popular one for the following year. And that's what they will develop the vaccine on. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. So the vaccine is changed frequently, but we do see lethal strains that appear periodically. I mean, the flu can be a deadly disease depending on the strain and who it's impacting. Generally, the older population are more impacted by the flu and have severe symptoms. The epidemic of 1918 and 1919 killed 20 million to 40 million people worldwide. This was the Spanish flu, or also known as the Spanish flu. Coincidentally, it's called the Spanish flu not because it originated in Spain, but because Spain was the first country to report on the flu. And for a while there was a concern about the bird flu and H1N1, probably about 8-9 years ago, but that was also a serious strain of the flu. There's also new bacterial threats. We have Legionnaire's disease, Lyme disease, strep, E. coli, and some antibiotic resistant strains. Some of these are a result of improper medical use. As you know, you will not get antibiotics every time you go and see a doctor because you're sick. They try to determine whether you're sick with a virus or a bacteria. If they determine it's a virus, you will not get antibiotics for that. And also the antibiotic use in agriculture. Tuberculosis is a leading cause of infectious disease death worldwide. 1/3 of the world population is infected. So as you can imagine, this is not a common disease in developed nations, right? In the US, I don't think I know anyone with TB. However, in developing nations, underdeveloped nations, tuberculosis is still a major problem. It is more common amongst our poor countries. It's more common in areas where people are living in very close quarters together, and there's not adequate medication in those areas as well. There was a resurgence in the US in early 1990s. The risk of TB is much higher for people with HIV because they're immunosuppressed. TB is transmitted by aerosol, so it's in the air, so think of people with TB coughing. And it is a 50% fatality rate if it's untreated. Antibiotics are effective, but they must be taken for several months. Again, in the US, not a big deal when you have access to that kind of medication. In underdeveloped nations, it's a huge deal if you don't have access to doctors, you do not have access to antibiotics, and you don't have the money to pay for antibiotics for a few months. In addition, the improper use of antibiotics leads to resistance, so antibiotic resistant strains, and then the mortality rate is higher than 50%. There was a antibiotic strain that was going rampant in the Russian prison systems. And what would happen is the prisoners would get TB, The prison system would give them antibiotics for a little bit. The people would feel better, and then they would stop the antibiotics. What happened there is that even though they felt better, they still had TB in their blood. It was just at a lower rate. Now, the TB in their blood, as the antibiotics went out of the system, the TB was able to mutate to coexist with the antibiotic, effectively making that antibiotic not effective in killing that strain of TB. We look at public health response to emerging infections. So there are global surveillance, improving public health capacity, veterinary surveillance, looking at livestock and animals, trying to reduce worldwide the inappropriate use of antibiotics, the need for new vaccines, the need for new antimicrobial drugs, and then controlling this vector-borne and animal-borne disease. So what can we do when it's rabies and it starts off in animals, or it is malaria that starts off in mosquitoes, right, the vector-borne? We have to figure out ways to control it when it's not started in humans. In addition, there is a threat of bioterrorism. So this approach to bioterrorism is the same as it is for natural disease outbreaks. Will probably first be recognized by surveillance if there is a bioterroristic attack. And again, the best defense is going to be the same methods as the natural outbreaks. This concludes our lecture for week 3. I hope you all have a wonderful week. And as usual, let me know if you have any questions or concerns.